Hello, my name is Oscar Fire, and welcome to a video. Wow, that was a great intro. Anyway, so yeah, this is going to be, okay, there's actually a million things I really should say, but I'm not going to say them at this exact moment just because there's multiple videos I really need to make or want to make and don't have the motivation to make because I honestly just said it on Twitter, and it's probably what gave me the... Probably just saying it out there, even if no one's ever going to read it, is probably what gave me the impetus to actually finally just, hit the record button on Audacity here. But, yeah, hi, hello, and welcome to a video about Star Wars and Star Trek. I should have drank something before I started this recording. Son of a gun. I'll get to that eventually. I'm sure that my body will tell me that your throat's too dry, you're going to start coughing. If it comes down to that, so I'm just going to talk for now. Anyway, yeah. First things first, though, I just want to mention, of course, that, yeah, there's eventually going to be a vlog coming up. I've been wanting to make one for a little while now, a bit of a post-mortem on Extra Life 2018. I've been wanting to do that for months now, but I just... Finding motivation to do things when you're tired from work all the time just doesn't happen very often. So, that's not happening right now. But, besides that, there are several projects pending, and I do want to play Third Age Total War because Divide and Conquer version 3 released, of course. But, I'm not getting to that quite yet. I had 2 days off, but I just didn't feel like doing anything. The sheer amount I want to just kind of like veg out after working is just... It's just... Anyway. Not gonna go off on that particular tangent. But yeah, today though I did actually want to just talk about Star Wars and Star Trek. It's dark at the moment, so I'm not gonna have my face isn't on the screen right now. So what I'm probably gonna do is have like video clips of me playing Star Trek New Horizons for Stellaris, and probably Star Wars, or probably Awakening the Rebellion for Empire at War in the background as I talk. But, I wanted to talk about this topic because it's been kind of, it's been on my mind lately. In no small part because, as we all, I should say, rather. No, I'm not a huge fan of Star Wars The Last Jedi. I'm not a huge fan, actually, of the general direction that, that Disney's been taking the Star Wars franchise in. And it's really funny because apparently because right now I'm currently logged into Final Fantasy XIV as I'm recording this. And there's apparently a character named Han Solo just under one of these menus I have up on the screen right now. And I just found that coincidence to be very funny. Anyway, but yeah. But yeah, I wanted to talk about it because I'm actually not, because of course I'm not, in the same way that I'm not a big fan of the direction of the Star Wars franchise currently. I just did the wrong thing here. Anyway, I'm also not a fan of the current direction of the Star Trek franchise. And I just wanted to talk about that for a bit. But I didn't want to talk about it in the way you think, because... I mean, I'm going to talk about that topic, but I wanted to talk about Star Trek versus Star Wars. Because... something's something interesting to me. Because sometimes when I look at comments of people reacting to the current state of Star Trek, which is not great, sometimes I see disgruntled Trekkies who are like, I don't like Star Trek right now, it's too much like Star Wars. And it kind of, first of all, brought up the age-old debate of Star Wars versus Star Trek, which is better, which do you prefer, etc. But it was funny because I was thinking about this. Like, I was thinking about, is Star Trek actually better than, or is which is better, which is Star Trek or Star Wars? Is Star Trek more like Star Wars? And that's a really interesting question. Now, of course, I'll come out right up front and say that I do have a natural bias towards Star Wars. I'm a bigger Star Wars fan than I am a Star Trek fan. But I am a big fan of both franchises. I love both franchises. I grew up with both franchises. I grew up with a lot of sci-fi, really. I grew up with the original Battlestar Galactica. Why am I talking like I'm from a different region of the country. Like, why did you say Galactica? Like, gosh, it sounds like I'm from Southern Indiana. What the hell? Am I picking up the accent or something? Anyway, but I grew up with Battlestar Galactica. I grew up with Babylon 5. You know, I grew up with all sorts of science fiction because I loved the space and the space action and everything. And so I'm a big fan of both, but I am a bigger fan of Star Wars versus Star Trek. So if my, if my thoughts here seem a little biased towards Star Wars, well, they are. I'm more invested in Star Wars than I am in Star Trek. As it stands, Star Trek has been kind of on the wrong path for much longer than Star Wars has been. So it's really so there's also just been more time to think about Star Trek's condition, and, there's more Star Trek to judge than there is of Star Wars content that has been produced. But first I want to kind of get down to that sort of philosophical debate before I talk about anything else, because, well, we all know if I go on a rant video, then I'm invariably going to ramble and get off on tangents and forget what I was originally going to talk about. In fact, I tried to record this a couple of days ago when I was really tired, and I thought back on it, and I'm like, wait, I didn't talk about anything I wanted to talk about in that video. I only touched on the things I wanted to touch on briefly, and I just didn't get to anything else. It was kind of funny. Like, I didn't even have to listen to it again. I just woke up the next morning, I'm like, wait, shit, I didn't talk about anything I wanted to talk about in that video. But anyway. So there's the debate. There's the debate between Star Wars versus Star Trek. There's this general perception, of course, that Star Trek is more cerebral than Star Wars, and Star Wars is more action-y than Star Trek. And superficially, these things are true. The best of Star Trek is definitely more cerebral than, like on average, the best of Trek is more cerebral than Star Wars, and the best of Star Wars is more action-y than Star Trek. But I've always thought that sort of thinking is way too reductivist. Like, it reduces Star Wars and Star Trek down to the simplest terms and kind of misses the things that make both franchises even great. I think one of the best ways to actually break them down is to kind of think about like what these franchises are at their core. So what is Star Wars at its very core? Star Wars is a story about people. It's about the adventures of heroes. It's, the hero's journey in Luke Skywalker. It's about, people meeting individual goals and becoming better and so forth. Luke is, of course, the classic hero's journey. Han Solo is the story of a man who's, the story of a man who's learning to be bigger and better than what he originally is. Princess Leia is attempting to save the galaxy in a grander sort of way to restore the old Republic. And of course, but Star Wars also is a story of redemption, the redemption of Darth Vader, for falling to the dark side. Or even on a lesser extent, the redemption of Obi-Wan and Yoda, of trying to fix the mistakes that they made in the past regarding Vader. There's all sorts of stories, and they're all fundamentally human tales. They're all tales about people and their lives. So what is Star Trek? What is Star Trek at its core? Star Trek is a tale about humanity. Star Trek is a tale about humanity becoming better than itself. There are people in the story, but in the grander scheme of things, and most exemplified by all of Trek's best episodes, it's about humanity overcoming its base instincts, overcoming its weaknesses, and becoming a better version of itself. And at its very core, generally speaking, Star Trek is more cerebral in this regard than Star Wars is, because Star Wars isn't necessarily about this big overarching theme of humanity, but it's about specific individuals trying to make their universe a better place. Whereas Star Trek is about, like a bigger group of individuals, kind of representing a subset of humanity, trying to make their universe and their society a better place. And I've never understood why people seem to think that these two franchises are in any way incompatible or really competing with each other, though. Because at the end of the day, sure, they are about different things, and sure, they have different elements, but at the end of the day, aren't Star Wars and Star Trek functionally about... Aren't Star Wars and Star Trek about something trying to be better than how it starts? You know, I mean, there's a reason I've always said that I hate I hate this sort of reductivism that kind of goes on between the two communities. And I always hate it more when it comes from Trekkies. Because Trekkies always, because you can always tell when a Trekkie actually hasn't watched Star Wars, you know, because they complain about how Star Wars is just some sort of mindless action flick, when in fact it is not. You know, Star Wars by its very nature is in fact the more impactful franchise than Star Trek is. Star Wars has much greater cultural penetration than Star Trek ever has. You know, people don't just recognize a few random lines or a ship or two. You know, they recognize, you know, like you talk to a random person on the street and they'll recognize tons of things. They'll recognize characters, they'll recognize famous lines, they will recognize even music, you know, from Star Wars. Whereas with Star Trek, it's all kind of, they'll recognize a couple of characters, there's quite a few like notable quotes, you know, maybe a ship or two, and maybe the Next Generation theme. And that's about it. But the question is, why is that? You know, is it really true that the dumber franchise is it really true that the dumber franchise is actually the one, you know, is the one that's more popular? And I don't think that is. You know, the simple fact of the matter is Star Wars resonates with people better because it's a more human tale by its very nature. There's more to connect with in there. We can connect with Luke Skywalker. We can connect with Princess Leia. We can connect with Han Solo because there's parts of them that are reflected within us because they are people. You know, and I've never understood the argument that for this very reason, I've never understood why Star Wars is inferior to Star Trek, because it's not. What Star Wars is a different kind of story. It may not reach the same lofty heights that Star Trek does, but that doesn't mean it's worse. It's kind of more just parallel to Star Trek. You know, it hits on different aspects of the human condition than Star Trek does, generally speaking. Because of course there are plenty of episodes of Star Trek in the various Star Trek series that kind of hit on the same issues that Star Wars does. That kind of resonate in the same way that Star Wars does. I think this is why a lot of people who are fans of both franchises probably find that Deep Space Nine is the best Star Trek series, because of course Deep Space Nine is a little less cerebral than the original series or the Next Generation, and is a little more character focused and has more stories that focus on characters and characters' developments and so forth. You know, but I just want to talk a bit too about like how Trek, you know, about Trekkies' misperceptions about Star Trek, about Star Trek's superiority, because of course, first of all, they misinterpret Star Wars as a mindless action flick, which it's not. It's more actiony certainly. But I've always said that Star Wars is actually an adventure film. I'm certain I said that I said that in a couple of the videos I made about various Star Wars things. But Star Wars is more of an adventure film. It's not an action film. It's a film with a lot of action. Don't get that wrong. It has a lot of action in it, but the action is in service to the story. You know, it's not like the action is the central focus. The action serves the story. And of course, I talked about how the prequels failed to do this to a greater extent, where the action sometimes was just there for its own sake rather than to actually serve the general story. But in the original trilogy, certainly is true. You know, the Battle of Yavin isn't just a battle; it's Luke's coming of age. You know, the battle of Hoth, you know, isn't just a cool ground battle. You know, there's a lot more to it all than that. And let's not also be arrogant here and just assume that Star Trek is automatically better, because Star Trek is full of plenty of bad episodes too. You know, the original series is very hit and miss when you really kind of get down to brass tacks. It's very dated when you watch it now. It's still great, and there's still really, really good episodes of the original series, but it's not perfect. Star Trek Next Generation is the same way. Its first 2 seasons are full of atrocious episodes. It's full of great episodes. They have good episodes too, but the great episodes really don't start coming until, you know, season 3 and 4 and 5. You know, but, you know, so let's not be silly here. You know, every Star Trek series and also the movies have plenty of bad entries in them. You know, but again, the whole point is that Star Trek and Star Wars, I think, aren't necessarily better or worse than the other. They just are. You know, and it's funny, too, to me, because, of course, you know, you can also get down into debates over, you know, like, what would win in a battle, a Star Destroyer or the Enterprise D? Spoiler, I think it would be the Star Destroyer, but I'm not getting into that particular debate today. But I always thought that, you know, those kinds of debates I think are also silly because they kind of miss the point. They kind of miss the point because, you know, in a lot of ways, like in certain elements, like certain people would never fight. Like, for example, Captain Kirk and Luke Skywalker would never actually get into a fight. You could hypothetically pit them against each other, but that's kind of silly because they're more aligned than they are opposed. The more interesting contest, frankly, would be Darth Vader versus Captain Kirk. But I wanted to talk. But yeah, I did want to talk about these ideas in a more general sense, just because the debate I think is worth having, but I think the debate is silly because people on both sides of the debate always come to their own conclusions about the other person's franchise, and when two people are having a debate but they're talking past each other, then the debate is completely pointless. You know, at some point you have to actually address what is, you know, you actually have to address each other's points rather than make a point that is completely, you know, as just like a straw man argument. You know, like calling Star Wars a mindless action film is, you know, mindless action films is, you know, is just as stupid as saying that, you know, it's just as stupid as saying that, you know, well, Star Trek is too far over the heads of people, you know, because neither thing is true. And part of me, I remember when I was recording the previous video of this, I remember part of me kind of like started rambling about like the best episodes of Star Trek, which of course depends on what you could consider the best episodes. And part of me wants to talk about it, but I don't know if it's actually going to go anywhere. So I'm going to talk about it anyway, but I just don't think it's going to actually, going to go anywhere. So, because part of me was thinking, because it is somewhat relevant, because the thing about it is that in Star Trek, there's a lot of different episodes with a lot of different themes and a lot of different ideas presented, right? And sometimes it's very hard to pin down what the actual best episode of Star Trek is, because it all comes down to taste, you know, like what resonates with you the most, what is the most interesting to you, what captures the concept of, you know, what captures the concept of Star Trek the best. And I feel like I would come up with two different answers if I were to ever say what's the best episode, period, throughout all the series of Star Trek. Because if I was going to say what's the best episode of Trek when it comes to Star Trek itself, as a general idea and a general theme, I think I would give it to The Measure of a Man from Star Trek The Next Generation. I can't remember if that one was in Season 2 or Season 3. But what I do remember is the general gist of the episode. I remember what it was, that basically Captain Picard had to fight for Data's right to be counted as an individual with rights. You know, there's some, there's some racial allegory in there, of course. But it's a very interesting and it's somewhat nuanced episode, because it doesn't really beat you over the head with how wrong, the scientists in the Federation are for wanting to basically confiscate data. They want to take data so they can research him. Because of course, Data is a highly advanced android. Data is a very advanced android who is, who has the most advanced computer brain known to the Federation. More advanced than those shipboard, than the shipboard computer that they're always talking to. And Captain Picard basically has to go before I don't know if tribunal is the right word, but a hearing, and argue the case for Data's humanity, and argue for the case that Data that Data is in fact an individual with rights and the right of self-determination. And that episode resonates with me. I think it is absolutely the best Star Trek episode when it comes to that whole overarching idea of humanity trying to be better. Because it tackles this whole idea of there being it tackles this idea of, like they basically, it's a whole new, basically Data's a whole new life form. And does this whole new life form, this whole new sapient life form, have the same rights as a flesh and blood individual, whether a flesh and blood individual is, human or Vulcan or Andorian or whatever. And I think that there's a, I think that it just, I love how The Measure of a Man captures that fundamental concept of Trek. But, that being said, if I were to pick my all-time favorite episode of Star Trek, it would go to In the Pale Moonlight of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. What was it, season 6? And it's the episode where Captain Sisko basically is trying to persuade the Romulan Empire to join the Dominion War on the side of the Federation Klingon Alliance. And it is the most interesting episode of Star Trek because it is so nuanced. It doesn't even try to pick a side. It lets you judge for yourself Captain Sisko's actions, because of course Captain Sisko basically works with Garak, the former agent of the Cardassian Obsidian Order, to try and persuade a Romulan senator, Vreenak, that the Dominion presents an existential threat to the Romulan Star Empire and needs to be dealt with. And he goes through all sorts of things, and eventually he tries to create basically false evidence that, because basically there's no evidence that the Dominion's actually it poses an immediate threat to the Empire, to the Romulans. It will eventually, and everyone knows it. So what he does is, with Garak's help, he fabricates evidence. He fabricates evidence of Dominion guilt, and Vreenak uncovers it and is going to return to the Romulan Empire and report that. And basically, without Sisko's knowledge, Garak assassinates Vreenak and plants evidence that it's the Dominion that did it. And ultimately, at the end of the day, Sisko, of course, is furious with Garak because Garak committed a murder. But at the end of the day, Sisko, because ultimately Garak's ploy works and the Romulans do join the Federation Alliance. And Sisko says at the end of the day that he can live with himself. Something really evil happened on his watch. But he said he could live with himself. And while it surely doesn't live up to the lofty ideals of Star Trek and the ideals of the Federation, it is such a fascinating episode. It's such a fascinating character study of Ben Sisko. And I think that absolutely hands down is my favorite episode of Star Trek. And episodes like these two make me wonder why people think that Star Wars and Star Trek are so different. Especially within the Pale Moonlight, because In the Pale Moonlight is such an amazing character-driven story. Just like Star Wars is. Star Wars is an amazing character-driven story. And why you think that these two franchises should be in opposition to one another is so silly. It's so stupid. Because they're not. They're both great. They're different. One certainly has more action in the... Ooh, excuse me. One certainly has more action in it than the other. But why does that make one better than the other? It certainly doesn't. I think it's very easy for someone like me to like both franchises at the same time, because both franchises have something to love. They both have characters to love, they both have stories to love, and they both have things that at the end of the day you can chew on inside your head. You can think about it and analyze it and wonder about it and learn something from it. Anyway, that is that. Maybe one day I'll make another video about the geekier elements of it, like, you know, like about whether or not who would win in a war, the Federation or the Galactic Empire. but that little conflict is for another day. I just wanted to talk about that because it's been on my mind a lot lately, and I just want to talk about it because I think it's a debate worth having, because they're both great franchises and they're both worth talking about. So anyway, I want to thank you for watching this video. I hope that you enjoyed it. Leave a like and a comment below if you did. And I will catch you next time, as hopefully I create a channel update and a little post-mortem for Extra Life. Until next time, everybody.